Hey again, welcome to Babbling Moon or Babbling Zoom. Iconic. Oh, so um, let's jump into part two of the Final Fantasy linked timeline. Uh, so the best way of like starting this, let's just do a quick recap. Right. So in a sense, I mentioned that imagine if the world of Final Fantasy were really kind of just little continents, all connected. Much like Grand Theft Auto, where even though you pretty much have an island of content that represents New York or LA or whatever, you know that it's actually connected to a bigger continent, right? And in doing so, you realize how big the world really is. Uh, but because it's games, they want to try to isolate you to what you need for the story that focuses on the story. Kind of like how in a movie you go from one location to another location without having to actually span the length of the rest of the country. Think about it that way. You also have two moons. One is the actual moon, and one is an artificial moon that came from somewhere. Always kind of a main thing that keeps coming up. You also have crystals. For these crystals are based off of for these crystals are basically based off of elements. You also have 4 other crystals in some games that are based off of other elements. Not elements, but like one is like time, one is light. So these are the other. Everyone knows about the 4, which are usually given to the light warriors. But the other 4 are considered dark. There's also something known as another world, a parallel world, a dark world. In this, I feel like, what if all the FF or the Final Fantasy numbered series belong in the main world, and then any offshoots belong in the other world, a world where you can jump back and forth. And in this idea, what if all my summons are people that passed away and carried over into the new world, right? On the artificial moon, you have people called Terrans or Ancient Ones. The name changes depending on the game. But if there's a moon, there's something on it. Sometimes even a summons can be on the moon as well. I think that's it. Now, let's dive into the main problem that I have of this layout. When I originally made this timeline, I kind of rushed it. And going back onto my notes from years ago, I realized that this timeline is wrong. So we'll fix it in a bit. But let's try to fully explain how I came about this idea of this is how the timeline should start. It all kind of stems from Final Fantasy 1. Right? Let me try a different color. Pops out more. This all stems from Final Fantasy 1. And then as we learn more about how I got to this point, we'll start fixing it, fixing the timeline. So I should probably do a new share instead. But share the internet. So there's two moments in Final Fantasy, the very first Final Fantasy, that kind of brings up this idea that it's all kind of interconnected in a weird way. So the first thing is when you meet the 12 sages. The 12 sages tell you of the disasters that happened when the fiends were there. It starts off saying 400 years ago, the wind took over and destroyed the planet. They started messing with the earth. Then 2 years after that, 200 years after that, the water started messing with it. And now the earth and then the fire are messing with it. The other key thing that comes up is the fact that Garland, the main bad guy that's starting this whole thing, jumped back 2,000 years to the past to start this mess. All right. So what do I want to call this? What do I call this part of the timeline? This whole thing is a time traveling story, starting from number 1. Surprisingly, that one thing that the creator Hironobu Sakaguchi created, surprisingly can actually start as be an origin story for this entire timeline. So the first part of the timeline that I want to bring up is the Sakaguchi era, naming after him, also known as the beginning. So let's fix this little bit here. I'm going to use my little 3-story act template. Actually, let's not do that first. Let's actually did I draw on that? I did draw on that. Oops. So let's start another one. All right. So the main thing we need to focus on is that in Final Fantasy 1, going off my notes, the events of FF1 spans 2,000 years. The first reason we know this is because Garland goes back 2,000 years near the end, and you have to chase after him to fight him. You know, 400 years ago, the world dealt with wind. 200 years ago, the world dealt with water. And it's not said what happened with earth and fire. Right? So this is what we're going to work with. This is the idea of it. And we're going to, because we're trying to encompass a whole bunch of it, the idea is the fact that we're going to try and work the beginning story with Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, and 11. Cool. So here's how we go. Here's how we go about it. Here's how I basically went about it. And pulling up my Final Fantasy notes. There we go. All right. So first we start with the beginning. In the beginning, a common theme that keeps popping up is a concept of chaos. Versus cosmos. Right? This war kept happening over and over again. This constant battle between these two forces happened over and over again to the point where, in the end, Cosmos managed to trap Chaos and the Seed Crystal from Final Fantasy XI. And in doing so, Cosmos ended up relinquishing all of his power into the universe, creating all the crystals and stuff. Now, part of this, Chaos is trapped, but still has power. Not for like, yeah, he's trapped, but full has power somewhat. In a way, he is able to still manipulate, but not truly fight. In doing so, clear across the universe, an entire system is slowly falling apart, where the inhabitants, called the Ancients, build a moon ship from Final Fantasy IV, and use that to try and settle on different planets. This one moon ends up stopping on Gaia. All right. So Act 1. So the second moon arrives at Gaia. Or whatever they want to call this planet over and over and over again throughout all the games. When it happens, the inhabitants of the ship stay asleep. And Noah and his three disciples come out and overlook the land. Noah, seeing the land, says to himself, I'm going to fix this land and teach this culture, teach this land magic and technology. And in a way, him and his people are, him and his 3 followers are regarded as gods. When Noah dies, let's go to his 3. When Noah dies, with the last of his breath, he actually turns to his three disciples and says, I'm going to give you something. For Durga, he gave them the power of magic. For, was it Yune? He gave her the power of the dream world, or the ability to control the dimensional shift of the dead, or the other world, the other dimension. For Zande, he gave him the ability to live as a human, which completely pissed him off. That's what happens. Like, instantly, Zande feels this is like a slander. I've done this work for you, and you leave me with mortality. This is ridiculous. And in doing so, he vows that he will destroy his teacher's gifts, his teacher's creation. He will decimate this world. He doesn't care anymore. Now, there you go. Start. So the rest of the story kind of focuses on Zande, whatever, with a Z or an X, however you want to spell it. Now, given this moment, Zande is pissed off with rage. He is human. He is angry. At the exact same time this is happening, Carlin shows up from the future and implants and creates his 4 fiends. This is what he's been planning to do this whole time. This starts the paradox. And this also starts the partnership. After planting the four fiends, and emerging from the future with like 5 bats, which are the, later you find out in Final Fantasy 1, are Dragoon Warriors. He ends up creating his fiends and putting him in dormant state for later when they're going to come back and transform and destroy everything. On top of that, he ends up turning these bats into demon dragons from Final Fantasy 3. After finishing his work, he slips away and ends up meeting up with Zende. He needs someone in power who's able to weave through this and help things move along. To help him, what he does is he gives him a semblance of immortality, which now I've got to pause because all right, so back again. So let's move something around real quick. Because if this was a big story, this is how it should work. Yeah. No, I didn't realize I put it on that layer. That's wrong. I wasn't supposed to put it on that layer. Oh, okay. So if this was a big story, be Act 2. Zidane is mortal and he's trying to figure out how to destroy the world, which after Garland is, Zidane is mad. He was trying to figure out how to destroy the world and he's trying to figure out, okay, how do I do this? How can I do this, but I'm mortal? In comes Garland with the 4 fiends, and he's like, I need time. And to give you more time to help me with my plan, I need you to be immortal. So he sets him up with some technology. And gives Zande a way of being immortal. In doing so, now he starts his mission. I'm nibbling too, by the way, sorry. So jump to Final Fantasy IV. Using Final Fantasy III as a base for most of this, for some of this, we learned that something happened 1,000 years ago. From one of the events from Final Fantasy III, right? This can actually be the event of Final Fantasy IV. So I thought I was going to do this in Roman, so let's do it in Roman. Right? So what happens? So as Zidane's slowly trying to understand the concept of being like immortal. Garland ends up going up to the moon or sending notes or getting away to get Zemus in the moon, a fiend in the moon, or a person in prison on the moon. He learns about Garland's attempt to create the fiends. And with everyone's idea of this whole thing being perfect, Zemus starts his whole, or Zemus agrees to try and wipe out all the the lives on the planet. And this starts the whole mind control storyline. In part of this storyline, in part of Final Fantasy IV, the king, one of the kings, ends up dying and becoming one of the victims. When he eventually dies, this can be the catalyst for him becoming Odin when he goes to the other world, the other dimension. The story ends with the concept of these 8 crystals. Since the 8 crystals are there, they open a gate to the artificial moon. And Zemus ends up failing to get out. The guardian of the ship decides this is too crazy and travels away from the solar system, with the moon leaving. The 5 crystals are 5 of the crystals are actually moved to a different continent. Imagine, in a way of like showing how the crystals move back and forth from different parts of the continent to try and get them away from certain areas. So the events of 4 can actually be the concept of Final Fantasy 3. All right. So the idea is Zemus tries to destroy the world, but fails. This is a story of Garland influencing. When you get to the next part, we jump into Final Fantasy 2. In that continent, the word of the Fiends have reached the Emperor. And with his armies, he ends up managing to find one of the fiends, Tiamat, Fiend of Wind, and is using that to control the area, the world, or his continent. He also wants to open up a gate to hell, which for them, they don't realize is the other dimension that holds all the summons and all the other things. In this story, this is where 4 kids come to try and stop the thing. Let's try to stop it. In Final Fantasy 2, you play as actually 3 kids, while the last one is Vanish. Now, the end fight focuses on the base major conflict that happens in Final Fantasy 2 is the fact that there is a cyclone. And the final fight has a lone dragoon warrior jumping into a cyclone to try and take out the Emperor. All right. So let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to get this all set up. So this is FF4. Once we start getting here, FF2, introduces a cyclone with the wind. Then we get to Final Fantasy 3. So in Final Fantasy 3, with the moon gone now, Zidane is freaking out. Let's put Final Fantasy 3. Let's get back to this. Got it. Sorry. Try to find my notes. Just quickly writing. So you got Emperor. Mattis. And a cyclone. But he's stopped by a dragon. All right. So now we get into the final act. The final act of this story ends, focuses on Final Fantasy 3. Well, let's combine 3 and 1 in a way. So multiple attempts have been tried to destroy this planet, and we have now with Final Fantasy 2, we've introduced the first theme. In Final Fantasy 3, imagine if Zidane was still fighting. Xande was still struggling. He is frustrated. He's seen all this destruction. And in doing so, he kind of does the unthinkable. He managed to submerge the planet in water with a massive earthquake. But I just missed something. So, but in doing so, he awakens the 4 light warriors and misses the fact that there's a small island that holds the 4 light warriors. On this island, this floating island, there's the wind crystal, which calls out to the light warriors, and upon meeting them, imparts them with abilities. And throughout the entire thing, this is where you start learning the stories of this is where you learn the story of Noah and the 3 others, and how this whole thing has been orchestrated through chaos. who's still trapped but still working through people. To truly stop chaos, the guardian ancient unit and Dorga, who are still alive at this point, sacrifice themselves to open up the gate to the Crystal Tower, which holds the Mirror Gate and 5 demon dragons protecting it. These 5 demon dragons were the 5 bats from Final Fantasy I taken to the past. Blight Warriors defeat the dragons, enter the Dark World, and destroy the Dark Crystal's powers. In other words, they go through to the other world and restore the power there. So this frees the warriors, the 5 dragons, and now they are sent back. This frees the warriors, and then all of them fight and defeat chaos. The flood from Final Fantasy 3 now becomes the legend from Final Fantasy 1. So this becomes Final Fantasy 3. Now let's rearrange some stuff because I forgot some stuff here. So let's get rid of this. This is what I forgot. Bear with me, still working on this. I forgot to mention Final Fantasy 11. Now here's what the role of Final Fantasy 11 does. It starts conflict. So what type of conflict? Given the ability of immortality, Xande is actually running around trying to start his conflict, right? Which kind of helps with the snowballing effect. And again, I barely played 11, so we'll see. Once I dive deeper into the Final Fantasy 11, I'll learn we could do more, or people in the comments can help me. So imagine if this whole war that started in Final Fantasy 11 actually started because Xande actually convinces the summoned soul of the Shadow Lord, Ryogrim, to start the Crystal War. Again, these crystals are imbued with the power of Cosmos. And what's better than taking that full power and destroying everything that Noah created with it, since he was not given any ability of magic or any ability of the dimensional rift. So he slips around and just starts trying to convince these people to fight. The Shadow Lord ends up being defeated. But this starts the key reoccurring things that pop up in Final Fantasy. So it's defeated. What was it? The Shadow Lord was defeated, but not before Sid created his first airship. Right. In doing so, Sid's name becomes a popular name among engineers. Yeah. So this starts the wars rolling, and Sid's name becomes legend. So let me try to finish up this one thing with number 3, and then we can end it with number 1. So also forgot to mention that in 11, they end up freeing Chaos, and everyone keeps fighting. So when we get to number 3, Zidane tries to submerge the world in water, fails because light warriors are there. And in his final attempt of crazily trying to get this done, to stop Chaos, or like I said before, I'm mumbling. The main thing is the final fight between Final Fantasy 3 is the fight between the 3 disciples. Zidane is struggling completely to try and destroy everything. This is his story now. He wants to just completely destroy everything by ending time. In doing so, he summons Chaos. To try and stop it, the 2 other disciples kill themselves and gives them power. Again, I said it before. And at the end of that, Sunday ends up dying. Which now bleeds into Final Fantasy 1. Where Garland is slowly getting the power. And with Chaos now free with the paradox, he reaches out his power from time and space and ends up touching with Garland. By Chaos. Chaos reaches up to Garland, who secretly embeds himself with, Chaos reaches out to Garland, who in Final Fantasy 9 is actually an AI on the planet, on the moon. Who probably gets off by this point. I don't know. So he embeds himself into the kingdom and starts the whole paradox rolling. Becomes a knight, and slowly starts manipulating everything, trying to get everything set up so he could travel back to in the past and start the fiends all over again. By this point, in Final Fantasy 1, we were talking about the game starts talking about the fact that the fire fiend is about to wake up. So if that's the case, then Final Fantasy 1 could possibly be the fire. So who knows? But right now, this is where I believe this is the beginning, how it all loops into itself. From 1, he goes back, starts the paradox, continues. So thank you for joining me with that mess. From here, we really focus on the main question is, from here, what happens? At the end of Final Fantasy 1, when the Light Warriors go back in time, they're completely erased from history. It's legend. They don't come back. nothing. That's kind of like the last bits of the story of the when the credits are rolling. So if that's the case, then if the paradox, there's some timelines we could play around with. What happens after the fact that after the Light Warriors went into the past? What happens in the current time? You know, if Final Fantasy One was 0, then what happens after 0, right? If the Light Warriors go back into the past and change the paradox, then it starts an alternate history, starting from 2,000 years ago. What happens there? And what if at any point in this storyline they fail, starting a new timeline? So sorry for this being so long, but again, it's a stumble and it's a babble. So we'll see. Join me next time and put any comments you need on the bottom. If you know more about Final Fantasy, you've played most of these games to help me out with it, that'd be great. Again, I'm using Black Oni Mage most of the time. That's what I used when I got all these notes and stuff. And I'm trying to piece things together with the limited knowledge I have. So if you want to have fun with me trying to build this timeline, cool. All right. So see you next time.